Over the course of this past weekend, President Yoon Suk Yeol has become a criminal suspect facing an indictment and trial on charges of instigating an insurrection in the wake of his brief martial law on December 3rd. We have more in Press Perspective today. Hello and welcome. Hope your work week is off to a favorable start. You're watching Press Perspective for this Monday, January 20th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. Now, as the foreign media has gravely pointed out, President Yoon Suk Yeol this past weekend went from being a temporary detainee to an inmate on charges of one of the worst offences in the country's criminal court. For more on this, I have Celio Fioretti, a correspondent for French daily Croix, here in the studio. Celio, welcome back.
Glad to be here.
I also have Professor Hee-kyung of Law at Hongik University live on the line here in Seoul. Professor Cho, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Right, we'll start here in the studio. Celia, let's begin with the events that took place this past weekend, starting with the formal arrest of the president.
What a busy week for Korean politics. South Korea impeached President Yoon Suk Yeol was formally arrested on Sunday, days after being apprehended at his presidential compound in Seoul on Wednesday. So back on Wednesday, Yoon was arrested in an exceptional police operation. Started at 5 a.m. in Hanam-dong, where Yoon Suk Yeol lives. The police gathered around 1,000 investigators and a bit more than 3,000 riot police officers. After 5 hours using ladders to bypass the blockade made by the Presidential Security Service, they finally reached the house of the president and negotiated with him for a sort of surrender. He finally accepted to be held into custody by the authorities, but still claimed that the whole operation was illegal and unjustified. Surprisingly, that day, we haven't seen that much violence, even though the pro and anti-Yoon supporters were there in Hanam-dong facing one another. After a few days in custody, the authorities has to choose to either free the president or keep detaining him on charges for up to 20 days, a decision they finally took on Friday, and they asked the Seoul Justice to agreed on an arrest warrant for 20 more days. They were concerned that Yoon Suk Yeol would maybe destroy some evidences if he was to be free. So nowadays, it's the first time in Korean history that an acting president, a sitting president, is formally arrested for quite a grave crime, a rebellion against the state. After that, on Saturday, it was also the first time since the beginning of the crisis that Yoon Suk Yeol appeared in court. He went to the Seoul Western District Office court to defend himself and asked the judge to withdraw this arrest warrant. After 5 hours of deliberation, the president took for around 45 minutes. The judge finally decided to agreed on this arrest warrant really late at night, around 3 a.m. on Sunday morning. And when the news came, some protesters there decided to storm the courts.
Right, I was just going to ask you about that, Celio. So news of his formal arrest, formal longer arrest perhaps, immediately triggered some very shocking acts of violence at the Seoul Western District Court from his supporters, hardline supporters, I would say, in the wee hours of Sunday. I understand you were there to cover the story after the event, though.
Exactly, and there were sad and shocking images we saw online, on TV, on social media. Hundreds of supporters of Yoon Suk Yeol stormed a court building early on Sunday after his detention was extended, smashing windows, breaking inside. Yoon supporters swarmed the building, overwhelming the riot police that were there, trying to keep them at bay. Protesters blasted fire extinguisher at lines of police guarding the front entrance, then flooded inside, destroying the furnitures and defeating the office equipment. The police managed to restore orders a few hours after and arrested, now I think it's about 100 people. There were also injuries on both sides, mostly minors, but a dozen of policemen were severely injured by the rioters. I went there, as you said, as early as I could after the whole mess. And in the calm Sunday morning, you could still see over the pavement in front of the court shattered glass, shattered bricks that were removed from the wall. And some Yoon supporters were still there. And I think there's something important to note. As I was talking with them, they're mostly elders above 60 years old. And they strongly condemned the violence. And they said the rioters, in the most part, were young men in the 20s and 30s. And I think here, even though they believe the judge's decision was unfair, they still swore to remain non-violent. And there is really, I would say, a generational divide here between the more elder supporters and the younger ones. The elders, 60s years old and above, they lived through the martial law in the 80s. They have seen the political violence, and they know the cost and the reality of it. And since then, they know it's not a good way. It's never a good way to use violence in politics. But the younger ones, they haven't lived through that. And maybe for them, their political culture is a bit different, and they seem to accept violence as a political method. And they were saying it that day during the protest before the judge's decision. For them, they are content with violence. For them, it's not something really bad for democracy to use violence. And I think this combined to the speeches of some Yoon allies and Yoon himself, adding fuel to the fire, keeping with the conspiracy theories, it's really a dangerous slope we're going into. And there is answer to be given to that violence.
Right, dangerous, I would have to agree then. Professor Jo, dozens of arrests, as Celio mentioned, have been made following the storming of the court by pro-Yoon supporters. What charges do they face, Professor Jo?
Well, there are some obvious ones from what we've seen on screen so far. They broke into this court building, breaking window glass and destroyed property inside, defaced equipment, tried to actually take away, I believe, computer servers, covered up CCTV. But there's also violence that they committed against police officers as well as media reporters and cameramen. So depending on how the investigation goes and how serious the injuries are that are suffered by the victims, the charges will vary, but I would guess that it would include at least destruction of public property, criminal assault and battery, not to mention bodily harm, as well as grievous bodily harm, depending on the extent of injuries. And possibly, attempted homicide, because some of them went up to level 7 and other levels, looking for the very judge who issued the longer arrest warrant. And so those are just the sort of criminal charges that we can kind of see on surface, including obstruction of justice and interference with public carrying out of public duties, etc., etc. But I think much more serious is, and this is also sort of continuing on from what Celio was saying, is that this is not just an isolated incident, but it's really, for me, a continuation of the insurrection that is being attempted by Yoon. Because what Celio mentioned at the end, which I think is very important and which hasn't really been reported in domestic media, is that he actually interviewed the older participants in these pro-Yoon protest, and they were specifically saying that they are against violence, that they oppose violence, and they want to remain non-violent during these pro-Yoon protests. And so these mostly quite young men in their 20s and 30s who seem to have led and participated in the violent acts are obviously acting with different purpose. And there is very strong suspicion that this was previously organized. So this was not a spontaneous, act on the spur of moment, that they were driven so angry by the announcement of the issuance of arrest warrant that they decided to act on the spot. There is very strong suspicion and evidence that they planned this all ahead. Not many people know how to access the judges' offices, even within the court building. I go by there almost every week, and I've also been inside, and I know many lawyers who have appeared in the courtrooms inside, and there are separate entrances and separate elevators even for lay people and those people who actually work there. So unless you knew exactly how to get to the levels where judges' offices were, you wouldn't be able to find where the particular office was. And also, what we saw on video was that these people had flashlights. Now, who would actually bring along flashlights when you are protesting outside in the public? So that was another strange thing. And lots of other things like instigation by some of the ruling party politicians, some others who pass themselves off as, religious figures who are all advocating using violence with regard to those who have arrested Yoon, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think they should really, the perpetrators should really be facing a more serious charge of insurrection even, and attempted incitement, rioting. All of those much more serious charges, I think, should be laid at their feet.
Right, and speaking about politicians, Celio, what has been the response from the president as well as the political parties with regard to these violent protests?
As we mentioned, this violence needs to be addressed if the country doesn't want to spiral down into more violence. And we have seen some answers since Sunday. First, the Supreme Prosecutor Office described the violence against the law enforcement and vandalism as a grave crime that undermined the rule of law and the judicial system. It has instructed the Seoul Western District Office to set up a team to sternly address the matter, and said prosecutor will work hand in hand with the police to make the investigation. Acting President Choi Sun-mok also expressed strong regret over the violence at the court, also ordering the police to investigate it. On the other hand, the opposition party, the leader Lee Jae-myung, on Sunday denounced the violent clashes that erupted at the court, calling them inexcusable acts that endanger the judicial system. Now, for Yoon's camp, the reaction is a bit more controversial, in my opinion. In a statement issued through lawyers, Yoon lamented that the court did not recognize the just purpose of the martial law, which was his line for his defense since the beginning of the crisis. But he also called the police to adopt a lenient stance with the protester. And I think that sentence is a bit, we can say it's a bit dangerous. And also considering that the ruling party, the People Power Party, is supporting this line. The floor leader, Kwon Song-dong, also criticized Sunday's riot, denouncing the violence and saying it should not be okay, we should not be tolerate violence, but also admonished the police, claiming that the police has a sort of responsibility in the violence that they maybe instigated. So I think this, what does that mean to be lenient with the rioters? Is it okay to storm a court? Again, it's a dangerous thing to say, and we have seen with Trump during Charlottesville riots, when he said there's good people on both sides, and we have seen how that kind of idea of being okay with violence led to what we saw on January 6, 2020, with Trump supporters rioting the Capitol. So I think there is really a need to calm things down in the country, and the president and his party really need to cooperate on that.
And speaking about the president, very briefly speaking, Celio, how is the investigation against him going? Has he been cooperative?
So far, not at all, unfortunately. Even though he said on Wednesday he was willingly going into custody to answer questions, he didn't. Since his first arrest, the investigators approached him with around 200 pages of questions, which he didn't answer, only asking for his meal, apparently. He also didn't show up on the next day, on Thursday, the second day of the questioning, citing medical reasons, which just delayed the whole process. Overall, the president hasn't been cooperative, kept with his line of denouncing an illegal and unjust procedure and arrest. However, it didn't seem to matter that much for the investigators. According to them, even though the president didn't answer the question, they think they still have enough evidence against him to press charges, as they did. And for the first time, Yoon appeared on court on Saturday. He did talk for around 45 minutes to restore his honor and defend his martial law, but that didn't really convince the judge at the court. After that, he was sent back to his detention, where he was since Wednesday. So now what's going on? The authorities asked him also to appear for questioning today, which he refused. Now the investigators are expected to maybe force him to come, or maybe visiting him at the detention center. Meanwhile, before his arrest, Yoon also has a trial at the Constitutional Court, which he didn't go for the first audience. Now maybe it's a bit more difficult to go for the next one opening tomorrow, but still he's not expected to go there either.
Right. Meanwhile, Professor Jo, as Celio mentioned earlier, the president and his legal team continue to contest the validity of his arrest by anti-corruption investigators. Now, for the sake of lay people like myself, can you explain their stance for us, as well as the local court's earlier rejection of their claim?
Yes, well, Yoon's team is arguing that CIO does not have jurisdiction to investigate the president with regard to the charges of insurrection. And technically speaking, they are correct. CIO was set up to investigate mainly corruption and graft type of crimes by high-level public officials, including the president. So their jurisdiction, strictly speaking, does not include the crime of insurrection, which will be the main charge against the president, against Yoon. However, what they have the power to do is to investigate any other possible crimes that arise out of the current crime that they are investigating, which is abuse of office. And that's completely within CIO's jurisdiction to investigate. Now, the reason why they filed for the initial detention warrant plus the recent arrest warrant with the Western District Court and not the Central District Court, as Yoon's team claims, is because they the usual rule is that you go to the court that has jurisdiction over the residence of the perpetrator in criminal cases. That's the usual rule. And because the president's office and also his residence is in Yongsan-gu, which is within the jurisdiction of the Western District Court, that's what they went to the Western District Court. But that's again being challenged. But coming back to CIO, essentially the argument is a very, very technical one. But because the insurrection charges are also related to abuse of office charges, which the CIO does have jurisdiction over, there is really no issue with regard to validity of their investigation powers, and that has been confirmed by the court 3 times so far.
Right. Professor Jo, we've also been told that the CIO will have 10 days of questioning of the president, and that will be followed by another 10 days of questioning by prosecutors. Has this also got to do with the jurisdiction factor? I mean, why this manner of interrogation?
Yes, exactly. Because the CIO does not actually have the power to indict with regard to the charge of insurrection. They will have Yoon for 10 days for questioning with regard to abuse of office charges, and then they will transfer him to the General Prosecution Office, which is expected to question Yoon with regard to the insurrection charges.
Right. Professor Jo, I'm afraid we have very little time left, but I would very much like your opinion on this. Now, I understand it's very early to say, but very cautiously speaking, What are your prospects regarding the outcome of the impeachment trial and the ruling's broader impact on the Korean society, which, as you and Celio both mentioned, remain greatly divided politically as we speak?
The impeachment trial itself is going at quite a brisk pace. The court has set 2 hearing dates per week so far, and they have, I think, set up to 8th hearing, and 13th of February is the last date that they have set. I expect that Yoon's team will request a couple more hearings after that, citing the need to interview a few more witnesses, and court will most likely grant up to a point those requests. But I would be surprised if the court does not hand down a decision by the end of February, at the latest early March. This is not a very complicated case. There is not a huge amount of evidence for the court to sift through, nor are there, long lists of witnesses that they have to interview and so forth. And the charges are very simple. The evidence is very clear cut. And so I expect that the decision will be handed down quite soon. And I expect that they will confirm the impeachment of the president and remove him from the office, particularly after what happened in the wee hours of Sunday morning, because what Yoon is doing is really undermining the rule of law and challenging the constitutional institutions in this country. And so we do need a constitutional court's decision to right the constitutional order in this land.
Right, and staying at the Constitutional Court, as you mentioned earlier on, Celio, the 3rd hearing is scheduled for tomorrow, that is January 21st. What are some key issues that the foreign media is interested in seeing tomorrow?
Well, to avoid the impeachment, you will have to prove that declaring the martial law on December 3rd was what they call a governing act, which means something that a president can do legally according to the constitution. Well, it's true, the Korean constitution allowed the president to declare martial law. It has to be done within certain rules, such as notifying the assembly, or be done during a state of national emergency, like war, for example, which are 2 really main points that will be discussed at the court. Yoon also argued that the martial law was done in a peaceful way, not seeking any harm to the legislators, not trying to arrest them or block any possible political activity. Problem is, military commanders, however, described quite the opposite. Former defense minister also described a deliberate attempt to seize the legislation that was blocked by hundreds of civilians on December 3rd. So following what has been said by the military officials, the military commanders, the former defense minister, it becomes a bit hard to believe that the president would avoid indictment on charge of a martial law that go against the constitution.
Right, and the former defense minister Kim Yong-hyun is poised to be the first to testify at the Constitutional Court soon. All right, Celio, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. And Professor Jo at Hongik University, thank you very much for your insights today.
Thank you.
Right, on that solemn note, we end this edition of Press Perspective. As always, thank you for watching.